keep learning, keep
Uh-huh.
being willing to learn. I think we're only barely tapping in to what the capacity is to have deep, connecting, transformational sexual relationships.
Welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. I'm your host, Dan Purcell, a Christian marriage and intimacy expert and coach. I'm on a mission to help couples have the best sex and most emotionally intimate marriages possible. Our episodes cover topics you've always wondered about and are packed with practical advice designed to help you take your marriage to the next level. Our childhood and families we grew up in have a profound impact on our worldviews, including our attitudes towards sex and intimacy. Not knowing anything different for the most part, we tend to intuitively model what we've seen and absorbed from the culture we grew up in. My wife and I are blessed to come from wonderful families. We had good childhoods and felt the support and care of our parents. I'm very grateful for it. Yet, after we were married, we were anxious about sex, which we felt was quite taboo, and for a long time really plagued us in our marriage. The reality is sexual growth and understanding is actually developmental, meaning we grow from stage to stage, line by line, one step at a time, if we choose the courageous path of growth. Like I said, it takes a lot of courage, trust, and determination to grow sexually as an individual and as a couple. There are many in midlife that realize their past attitudes towards sex and intimacy are no longer serving them today. They might come to a crisis in their relationship or feel stretched in their marriage to grow and progress. This podcast, my apps, my programs, and my retreats, I hope, help you, whoever you are on your journey, learn truths and apply principles to aid you in your spiritual and sexual development, as I believe those two are closely linked together. My guests today are Dr. Heidi and Dr. Scott Hastings. Heidi has her PhD in Human Development and Family Studies, and Scott is a medical doctor and physician. Talk about a smart power couple, right? They are also the hosts of the Marriage IQ podcast, and I've had the opportunity to get to know them personally over the last year, and I am excited that you get to meet them here today too. Can we talk about sexy romance for a moment? Valentine's Day is Friday, February 14th, and this year we want to do something we've never done before, and that is celebrate it with you in a very romantic and sexy way by putting on a virtual retreat. How it works is that you and your sweetheart join us live from your home or from a cozy hotel where we will guide you through a sexual practice that's fun and deeply connecting over 3 sessions. And the sexual practice we'll teach, it's good for anyone, whether you're comfortable with sex already as a couple or a little bit shy. I promise it's going to be a very positive experience for both of you. If you follow along with our instructions that we want to give you, it's going to be a really good experience if you set aside the time for it. You can join us live or you can catch the recordings if that weekend just doesn't work for you. And more details are on our website under Retreats and Virtual Retreat, or check out the link in the show notes below. Heidi and Scott, welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. How are you today?
Great. Thanks for having us on, Dan. We're happy to be with you.
Yes, thank you. We're glad to be here.
That's great. So to start things off, I want you to tell me a story of perhaps a time you felt really hot and bothered in the bedroom.
Well, let's
That's
just
often.
jump right in. Why don't we?
Yeah.
Do you want to take this?
Sure. What comes to mind is early on in our marriage, when we were married, the man who performed our marriage told us that the law of romance was something that we really needed to focus on and live, that the law of chastity, which previously had meant don't have any kinds of things that get you hot and bothered, then changed to the law of romance. And so at that point, we saw that as burning candles by our bed and
We used a lot of candles early on.
music, some good music, and we had a canopy bed. And so probably
Nice.
So for the guys out there, canopy beds have little lacy stuff that hangs off of it. I'm pretty sure it would not pass any fire codes.
yes.
Clearly did not pass fire code in our bedroom.
Right. So this particular time we were hot and bothered physically when we started to smell smoke and looked over and saw flames going up the side of the bed and on the pillow.
Because remember, this lace, it drapes down the bed. So the flames are shooting up the canopy.
So that splashed water immediately on our intimate moments and instead ran to throwing pillows out in the garage to try to squelch the fire.
So our bed was literally on
A
fire.
burning bed. Yeah. What a
That's
great way to start a
awesome.
marriage, huh?
That's a great bedroom blooper. That's awesome. So, Scott, you're a medical doctor, you're a physician, and
Mhm.
Heidi, you have a PhD. You're a power couple for sure. But
Oh,
I want
thank you.
can you tell me, Heidi, what was your PhD dissertation about and what did you learn from it?
Yeah. So my area of study is family studies and human development, an area that I really love. And I studied religious women and their experience with having a husband using pornography in a
Mhm.
problematic way or other compulsive sexual behaviors. And as part of that, I ended up really focusing on sexuality and how this impacts a woman's sexuality.
Great. What did you learn from the women you interviewed?
They largely told me that as a young woman and early in marriage, knew nothing about sex other than don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And then all of a sudden do it and it's going to be wonderful and it's going to be great. But they really struggled to make that transition. And in my study, I was studying several different Christian religions as well as Judaism. And I had a Muslim
Some Muslims.
participant as well. Yeah. And I will say the Jewish women had a very different experience. Their
Mm.
experience was very pro-sex, healthy sexuality. The men were to please their women every week before the start of the Sabbath, but the Christian women in my study, for the most part, had no comprehension of what healthy sexuality was like. And this seemed to amplify the distress that they felt when they were doing the best they could sexually to show up for their husband, and then because of pornography, felt rejected. Often, in 50% of the cases, they said he would not have sex with them,
Hmm.
probably because of masturbation during viewing pornography taints the ability for a man to be intimate when that is a
When their
long-term
energy is spent
behavior.
elsewhere.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
that's a great way to say
Gotcha.
that. Yeah. But they did later as they moved into healing, they wanted to understand what healthy sexuality was. They wanted to view it from a different lens than what they'd grown up with, which, for the most part was it's your duty to serve your husband.
Gotcha. So we're talking about human development here, and sexual development is that it's just that. It's a developmental process. We start someplace and
Right.
then we gotta grow into new capacities. Can you tell me about your own personal journey developing your capacities here? It might even mirror some of the stories of those you interviewed for your dissertation.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in a very conservative Christian home that we weren't really allowed to talk about anything sexual. My dad tried sometimes, but my mom kind of put a squash on it. And that for me set the example that this isn't something that you talk about. And when it was time to get married, the discussion was extremely brief, basically focused on my responsibility as a wife.
Mm, you have a duty to perform. I
Yes,
see.
yes. And so that's how I entered marriage. I was very young.
Mhm,
And then in that first marriage, there was a lot of infidelity.
mhm.
So that also really tainted the way that I felt about sexuality. So I had a lot of baggage from that. And yet when Scott and I married, I was excited to have a sexual relationship with him and he's been so amazing and patient with all of that. Uh,
That's great.
It's interesting hearing this story again. I think that it's a journey of learning, and I find it highly unfortunate that we don't look at sex more positively, as youth. And
Yes.
I think there's this concern that, "Oh my gosh, they're gonna take this information and go out and just screw everyone." But yet, if you look at data, that's not the case any more than if you weren't. In fact, probably even less so. And I just I don't understand why a lot of people have to live half their lives at least living in this kind of a sexual no man's zone, a purgatory, if you will. I don't get it.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, that's how it is. So I came into my marriage with Scott wanting to be close to him, excited for new possibilities, hoping for trust this time,
Mhm.
and yet I think I had still carrying with me a lot of the baggage from both religious scripts and
Mhm.
from betrayal trauma that
Mhm.
made it I think we had a decent experience, but sex was more on the periphery for me, and when he would suggest things, typically the good girl in me was,
Mhm.
"No,
Uh-huh.
I don't wanna
Uh-huh.
do that.
Right.
No, I
Uh-huh.
don't wanna do that." And he was good to always get consent, but I think it stunted the growth of our sexual development, mine at least. Well, yeah,
well, I think
'cause we're
it's
in this
interesting
together.
because I don't think you ever said no, as far as I can remember, but yet perhaps
No to having sex, but I did say no to certain things.
okay. It just appeared that, like you said, like sex was still kind of on the sideline.
Yeah,
It was something you did, it wasn't something that you are, right? And so that's took some time,
yeah.
did it?
And for us as humans who have kind of that similar background, the majority research shows stay in that lower level of development for their entire lives. 60% stay in that lower level of development.
Yeah, because it takes an incredible amount of courage to push through to get to that next stage, doesn't it?
Well, it takes courage or crisis. And
Yes. Uh-huh.
uh,
Right.
for the women in my study, it took crisis to be able to
Mhm.
look and say, as they were healing, as they were learning, something was missing. Something was really missing, and I wanna do things different now. Quite a number of them would say, "I wanna learn about healthy sexuality," and those who stayed with their husbands, which about a third did, they had completely transformed the sexual relationship within their marriage.
That's great. That's so hopeful. I like that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
tell me about your own crisis. I'm sure things didn't stay that way for a long time.
What are you
So
talking about? It was bliss from the beginning, and I'm a great liar.
So I don't know for me that it started out so much with crisis at that point. I'd had other crises that still didn't push me into future development and growth in this area.
Uh-huh.
But I did start to be curious about what's wrong with me. I felt
Mhm.
like all of the things that I hear other people talking about, I'm not experiencing. Yes, I felt very close to my husband when we had those deep sexual intimate moments, but I didn't have language to describe what I wanted. I didn't have really good understandings of the sexual biology and physiology of a woman.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and so
But you
I
didn't realize this at the time. You didn't.
well, I was starting to have little bits of yes, you're right, I didn't understand it, but I was
Mhm.
starting to become a little bit curious, and I found a book that was written from a religious perspective, which for
Mhm.
me as a religious woman is exactly what I needed,
Mhm.
and started to have these aha moments of, "Oh my goodness, I am not broken after all."
Uh-huh.
Because I think up to that point, there was a lot of not understanding. Scott would say, "Why can't you initiate more? Why can't you initiate more? Why can't you initiate more?"
Uh-huh.
I'm like,
Uh-huh.
"I don't know. I just don't think about it. I'm busy with the kids. I am busy with this. I'm busy with that." And I think a lot of times too, in those experiences, my head wasn't totally present, which I didn't understand was normal also.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so I was feeling, what is wrong with me? So this book really helped for starters. The second big thing I think helped was I felt very, very inspired to go to grad school. And as part of my human development and family studies program, if I wanted to become nationally certified as a family life educator, I had to take a class in family sexuality. And
Mhm.
I really wanted this certification. I really wanted to have those letters behind my name and that capacity and those possibilities, but I was dragging my feet on the family sexuality class. And I
Uh-huh.
saved it till almost the end, and I thinking and praying about it and eventually decided, yes, this is what I need to do. Went to the
Why
class.
by the
Oh, go
way,
ahead.
why do you think you felt so much resistance about taking the class? What were you anticipating being
It
uncomfortable about it?
it was at a university that was pretty liberal,
Mhm.
and I wasn't sure if my values would be,
Respected, maybe?
yeah.
Mhm.
And as well, I think I still just didn't have the language to speak about sex, and so it was just
Mhm.
really highly intimidating. With a good girl type of a syndrome, a lot of the things I heard other people talking about, I understood as sin. So that was how I'd framed it in my mind, that I still think there was an element of talking about sex that made me feel some shame.
Mhm.
So I took the class. It was about a 400-page textbook, of which only 3 pages were on marital sex.
Okay.
And
Uh-huh.
a lot of it was on things about sexuality that made me so, so uncomfortable. I
Mhm.
my fears were coming true, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And yet I had assignments that I had to do, and I would stress about it, I would cry about it, I would just stress and fret, and finally went to prayer. Just really, really sincere prayer, asking God to help me see sexuality through His eyes,
Uh-huh.
and things started to change. I was able to start finding resources, research that aligned more closely with my belief system,
Mhm.
and started to see women's sexuality in a different light. It's like Scott said, often defined through the lenses of men because early research is almost all done by men.
Mhm.
And yeah, do
If you wanna look at the definition of libido in research, it's through a men's perspective, and we need to change that.
you want to talk more about
Well,
that?
you go ahead and finish your story.
Okay.
Now's a good time. Let's talk more about that, Scott.
Yeah, I think it's a
Oh,
good time.
so, just it's interesting when we both, love to do research. So we look up studies, we're constantly looking at things, and the thing that's interesting to me is that when we talk about libido, when we talk about sex drive, we think that's sitting there thinking about sex. That's wanting sex. That's thinking
Uh-huh.
about my partner desiring to have sex with them. Okay. So we need to
Mhm.
back off, back away, and start thinking like a woman. Okay. And most
Tell me,
women,
how do women think?
well, no, look, I'm a guy. I can't change that. Right. But I can try really hard to get in the shoes of a woman. And the reality is, and there are several books and papers on like women largely do not think about sex. They don't wake up in the morning like men do and say, how am I going to get some nookie today? Like they just don't. And that's
Uh-huh.
okay. That's normal. That does not mean they don't have a sex drive. Because again, we're defining everything through what a guy thinks of as sex drive. And that is you wake up in the morning and I'm thinking about sex.
Uh-huh.
Um, a lot of guys,
Many times through the day.
many times through the day. About sex. So, really, a lot of times for women, that sex drive does not begin until actually intercourse has begun. And the process that begins with the penile stimulation. Of course, there are other things that go into play as well with foreplay and mentally and emotionally getting ready for it.
And emotional intimacy, yes,
But
prior
when
to.
you want to talk about sex drive from a female point of view, a lot of times it does not begin until sex has begun. And it's really hard for men to wrap their heads around this idea. But when we talk to women about that, and like this light bulb goes on, it's like, oh, yeah. And it's just defined differently. And so I think it's really important to be sensitive about when we talk about higher and lower desire partners if we're specifically talking about sex drive, I think, should be careful because we certainly don't want to label people and say, this is who you are, right? And that desire increases, decreases up and down between partners over a lifetime. And we want to make sure we define that because sometimes it may very well be that those libidos are matched. It's just we're defining them in a different way.
That's
It,
good.
it's I think it's a light bulb moment for a lot of women to hear that
Mhm,
presented that way,
mhm.
and they're like, "Oh, I'm not broken. I'm not,
Right. The brain is the
I,
biggest
I'm
sex organ for women and for men, but for women in making the decision first
Right.
and
Uh-huh.
and then paying attention to our bodies.
Right. So, Scott, what was your experience like with Heidi going through this sexuality class? What was going on your side of things?
well, I remember thinking it's about time.
Yeah.
I just
Uh-huh.
remember like this big weight off my shoulders and like, wow, this is awesome. And
Mhm,
this is, mind you, this is before all the kids are out of the house. And
mhm.
so our kids, I think they've been scarred for life, but I think in a good way. They know we have
Uh-huh.
a very healthy sexual relationship. They're very well aware of it. You can't hide
Mhm.
it much when they're still in the house. But I mean, it was the start of a new journey. And I'm like, okay, giddy up. Let's go. You know?
Uh-huh.
So a couple years before that, Scott had gifted me the book The Passionate Marriage by David Schnarch, Dr. David
Uh-huh.
Schnarch,
Uh-huh.
and
That's a very thoughtful gift, I should say.
I
Uh-huh.
didn't find it to be very thoughtful. I thought it was once again evidence that I was broken. Once
Uh-huh.
again, evidence that I wasn't enough.
I was really scared to show it to you. I waited
Uh-huh.
months before I showed it to you.
But
Uh-huh.
when I was doing my research for this sexuality class, family sexuality class, this is one of the resources that I went to. I remembered that he gave me that book.
Uh-huh.
And I loved reading what he's got in here about self differentiation, about
Mhm. Development in that
human
process,
development.
right?
Just goes along
Yes.
exactly with what I was studying at the time. And
Uh-huh.
I think I learned far more by reading his books, by reading some other research than I did at all with anything from the textbook or anything else in the class. And it was
Mhm.
a game changer.
Heidi, if you were to summarize the heart of the message of passionate marriage for people who've never heard about it before, what would you say is the heart of the message of the book?
Well, I feel like understanding my own identity and becoming strong in who I am, knowing what I believe, knowing what I think, knowing what my desires are, knowing how my body responds to things, just becoming more self aware and more focused on my sexual identity is
Mhm.
vital because if all of my sexual preferences based upon my husband,
Mhm.
it can do nothing good for me. It can do little
Yeah.
for me. And
Uh-huh.
and that became very evident in my research. The women started to feel their husbands pull away. They started to suspect something was wrong with either the pornography use or the other compulsive sexual behaviors, infidelity or whatever, and they kept trying to control the relationship through giving away their own sexual agency. Okay, I know I
Right.
wouldn't said I wouldn't do this before, but now I will do it. And like they gave away so much of their agency step by step by step that then finally when they figured out what it was that going on and they felt betrayed because of the behaviors, they had no leg to stand on. They didn't know who they were anymore. They had no solid, stable foundation of their own sexual identity, of their own self. So, having
Mhm.
a reflected sense of self in their case and in even my own case was more destructive than if we take that time and make that effort to understand who we are, what we believe, what we like, questioning our thoughts, and making that a part of our identity.
I would
That's
say
good.
with the passionate marriage, just learning identity, being intentional, learning insight, and
And growing intimacy, which those are the 4 foundational cornerstones of our podcast. And they came from my
Good.
research, which I did use some Dr. Schnarch references in my research too.
because isn't it true? Like if you have a truly passionate marriage, it's fearless. It's one where you feel very comfortable going really deep, very vulnerable, very intimate with your partner and being okay with each other
So I
on a
didn't
deep level.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because the other thing, the other side of that, and what I got out of this book is then I need to be flexible with what my partner thinks that's different than me. I don't
Mhm.
shame him and feel like you're bad, I'm good. I
Uh-huh.
don't I don't wanna use the I don'ts. I'd rather say I do curiously want to understand where his perspective is coming from and
Mm.
be open to talking about things in an intimate way without feeling like I need to fold into his same person. We're two individuals. Our superpower is that we think differently and we can bring both
Mhm.
schools of thought to the table.
Well, and let me tell you, Dan, that takes a lifetime to get there. It
Yeah.
does. It takes a lifetime of learning and sharpening the saw. Once you get there, it's because if you don't sharpen it, it just goes backwards. And
Mhm.
it takes a lifetime of learning about your spouse. I don't know my spouse. We've been married for 28 years, but I don't know her. And the moment I think I know her, I'm lost because
Uh-huh.
we've lost that intimacy because I've lost the curiosity. So
That's so
I
good.
I always have to be curious, even if I've known you now for 29 years. I don't know you, so I need to find out.
And that's always helpful in keeping a sexual relationship a little bit scintillating.
That's good. So tell me more about this class, this book, this research, and then your own dissertation. Now, if you had a message for the world, what would it be?
Oh my goodness. Let me add one more thing. Can I add in
Yeah, yeah,
one more
yeah.
part of my journey that was very transformational? And I was at a National Council of Family Relations annual conference here in the Dallas Fort Worth area and met Dr. Shalom Levitt, who you've had on your podcast. And she was
Yes.
teaching
Uh-huh.
about sexual mindfulness.
Mhm.
And that took our understanding of sexuality to a whole new level that was really beautiful and wonderful. And she and I connected, and she opened up so many of her resources to me. She was so generous with that. So perhaps that leads into answering your question, and that's keep learning, keep
Uh-huh.
being willing to learn. I think we're only barely tapping in to what the capacity is to have deep, connecting, transformational sexual relationships, and I don't think that is all about tips and tricks. I think
No.
it's about deep, deep intimacy, deep connection, deep learning together, vulnerable communication. Sexual communication is a big part of that. So,
That takes a lifetime, though. We say vulnerable communication, but what we mean by vulnerable communication is a lifetime of giving and taking, of perhaps feeling offended sometimes, or feeling hurt, or feeling angry, and then coming back, knowing the steps to repair, right?
Mhm.
Because when you say vulnerable communication, that takes an entire lifetime of getting there. And the thing that's funny, well, funny, exciting, whatever, how you want to put it,
Uh-huh.
is
Uh-huh.
that as we find new, deeper levels of communication between each other, it's even more grandiose, more scintillating than we could ever imagine. Like even before, it's like, wow. And guess what? It can only be done between one man and one woman. It's not between a man and a lot of girlfriends or prostitutes or a woman with having an affair with
It can't
the
produce the depth
scintillating
that uh-huh.
apex of life that I think God wants us to have, to experience, can only be found in this very deeply intimate, personal, lifelong experience with your spouse.
Mm.
and sometimes you think things are going to work and they don't, and you back up and you try it again.
That doesn't mean you run away.
Right.
That doesn't mean, "Oh, I'm out. This is messy. I don't want it."
Right. And when we get busy, sexuality can be one of the first things to go when there are so many busy, busy things. And so having it on the calendar, having it scheduled, making it a priority
Uh-huh.
is vital to keeping it moving, keeping that scintillating part of our marriage growing and transforming.
That is so good. Great. In all of this that you're talking about, I can see couples need to develop great sexual communication skills. Can you tell me about what you've learned along the way about how to communicate about sex effectively as a couple?
Yes, I think as I started to learn more about healthy sexuality, we realized sexual communication this is really important.
Mhm.
And because I formerly hadn't had the language to talk about it, needed to learn more about biology and physiology and more about sexual anatomy and terms and
But let's be honest here. It's hard. It's difficult. And so what we have done in our relationship is we have written it down as a weekly goal. Like it's written down. It's part of the
Uh-huh.
intentionality to talk about it every week. And I keep track. So I can see at the end of the year that what percentage of the weeks we talked about sex.
now with that, let me say it was not always successful and it was not
Uh,
always comfortable.
Yeah, no, I don't want you to have the illusion that it was this perfect, project, and
We
it's still a
mhm.
work in progress.
yeah,
To be honest,
we
it is.
we started out by talking about it on our dates on Friday night,
Uh-huh.
and my head's not there. That did
Uh-huh.
not work
Yeah, we
very well.
determined Heidi's head needs to be in the game, so we
So, for us, for my head to
my
be in
head's
the game
always in the game,
right.
so that's not a problem.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So, for me, my head is in the game right after we have sex. It's not in the
Uh-huh.
game 3 hours later or 3 days later or whatever, and so yeah.
We also this might sound funny, but every week we attend a religious meeting, and on the way, we read from this book on sex, and we discuss it. And so between those 2 things, right after sex and in the car,
Uh-huh.
and we record it, we remember, we discuss it. It's very nice to be able to have this weekly discussion on sex. Typically, when there's a request to do something sexually, this can be met with some resistance. So I think it's important to make sure that we're all in the right headspace when
Mhm.
we're talking about these things. To be open, make sure we're well fed, we're well rested, we are
Yes.
just open, and to present things in ways that are very open and not, well, I want this, you want that, or you want this, so you need to do this. Like that's the tit for tat thing is not does that doesn't work.
Right.
So
Right. Right.
Equal power, equal ability to give consent, all of those things are great things to include in sexual communication.
Right. It'd be equal partners in it. We share
Mhm.
something. As
Exactly.
my wife and I have been reflecting, our very best sexual experiences that we've ever had, just say our top 3, one thing in common is they all started very organic. It wasn't a produced thing, it wasn't a forced thing. There's this idea of coming to this base camp, this home place, and then things kind of unfold from there, and our worst sexual experiences are when it's not that way, it's like you're trying to produce something or we're trying to get to some sort of a goal or something, or it's about you don't do this enough. So, okay, I'll give in. So I do that. Then it's
Right.
just this forced thing. It's never ends up being a good experience. So I
I would
like
ag
that.
I'd agree,
well, I think things can be planned but not forced.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So planning sex is actually really healthy. Putting it on
especially
your calendar,
planning the
but
time.
so is unscheduled sex too.
Right.
But I see what your point, kinda letting it unfold organically is
Hmm.
really nice.
And that's where I think sexual mindfulness really plays in. That is such a great,
Yes. Shalom Levitt.
pathway for that. Yeah.
Yes. And for our listeners, I did a 3-week intensive seminar series with Shalom Levitt. You can find on our website and we go in depth on all these topics that we're hinting on here. So
Yes,
Mhm.
yeah, such a
it's
great
good.
program she's got there. Yeah.
Great. Very good. Where can people go to learn more about what you do and your podcast and things like that?
Well, we have our a podcast, Marriage IQ, or our website, marriageiq.com, and we bring research, we bring life experiences, we bring stories. We talk about how to become a better spouse by becoming a better person.
Hmm.
That the intelligent spouse knows that in order to change your marriage from a stinky to a scintillating one, first requires a change in yourself.
And
Hmm.
that links back into self-differentiation.
Hmm.
Have to know ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I also have a website, drheidihastings.com, with no period after the doctor, where I have some of my research on there. We have, uh, Betrayal IQ also that we're going to be starting up before very long, and we hope soon to launch Newlywed IQ, and
Very good.
sexuality will be a piece of all of these. It's all
Hmm.
human development. It's all based on our 4 foundational cornerstones again of identity, intentionality, insight, and intimacy.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to have you here and share your wisdom with me and with all of our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you,
for inviting
Dan.
us, and it's good to see you again.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Please share it, along with our apps Intimately Us and Just Between Us, with your married friends. I promise they will thank you for life. If you want a more meaningful sexual and intimate connection in your marriage, I invite you to check out my Get Your Marriage On program. Over 100 couples have said this program packs tremendous value and has helped their intimacy grow to the next level. Now, go get your marriage on.